For centuries, the border around Terran space existed as a quiet understanding rather than a threat. It was marked clearly on star charts, navigation systems, and trade maps, yet it carried no dramatic warnings, no flashing danger symbols, and no aggressive patrols lining the edge. Humans did not broadcast power or make speeches about dominance. They simply drew a line and expected others to respect it. To most civilizations, this restraint felt reassuring. To the Empire, it felt suspiciously weak. The Empire had risen by pushing limits. Every powerful neighbor it had ever faced relied on fear, intimidation, and constant expansion. Borders were meant to move, treaties were meant to be tested, and silence was often the first sign of collapse. When Imperial scouts reported that Terran fleets rarely ventured beyond their own space and that human diplomats avoided political games, the Empire's leadership reached a familiar conclusion. Humans were passive. Humans were cautious. Humans would bend under pressure. What the Empire failed to understand was that human restraint was not hesitation. It was discipline. Terran history had taught its people a harsh lesson. Long before humanity reached the stars, borders on their own world had been crossed again and again, often by those who believed patience was weakness. Each time, the cost had been enormous. By the time humans expanded into space, they had learned that the best warning was not a loud one, but a clear one. The line around Terran space was not a challenge. It was a final notice. Imperial ships began approaching that line under the excuse of routine navigation errors. A cruiser drifted slightly off course. A survey vessel lingered too long near a restricted system. Each incident was small, carefully calculated to provoke a response without starting a war. Other species watched closely, expecting angry broadcasts or military displays. None came. Terran Command logged the incidents, adjusted patrol routes, and continued as normal. Inside Terran space, however, every crossing was recorded in detail. Human analysts tracked Imperial engine signatures, command structures, weapon loadouts, and response times. Civilian traffic patterns were quietly altered. Defense platforms shifted into new orbits under the cover of maintenance schedules. Nothing visible changed, and that was exactly the point. To the Empire, the lack of reaction confirmed their belief. They spoke openly of Terran softness in strategic briefings. Advisors argued that humans had grown comfortable and isolated, unwilling to risk conflict for abstract principles like sovereignty. Younger officers mocked the idea that a species so quiet could ever pose a serious threat. The Empire had seen this pattern before. A small push would become a larger one, and eventually the border would no longer exist. What they did not see was how deeply humans respected that line themselves. Terran ships never crossed foreign borders without permission. Trade vessels followed routes with obsessive precision. Even human explorers, known for curiosity, adhered strictly to agreed boundaries. This was not fear, it was consistency. Humans believed that if borders were meaningless, then no agreement could ever be trusted. As imperial pressure increased, whispers spread through neutral systems. Traders noticed humans withdrawing assets from shared ports. Research stations closed without explanation. Families relocated from frontier worlds to inner systems in an orderly, almost rehearsed manner. There was no panic, no rush, only preparation carried out with quiet efficiency. The Empire interpreted these signs incorrectly. To them, withdrawal meant retreat. They saw a people pulling inward, abandoning the edges of their territory to avoid confrontation. Imperial Command began planning what they called a limited demonstration, a brief incursion meant to force negotiations on Imperial terms. It was not meant to be a war, only a reminder of who held power in the galaxy. From the human perspective, the situation was already beyond diplomacy. The line had been tested repeatedly, and intent was now clear. Humans did not believe in endless warnings. They believed in consequences that did not need repeating. Every system within Terran space had already received silent confirmation codes. Every defensive unit knew its role. Every commander understood the rules. The line that was never meant to be crossed was not guarded by anger or pride. It was guarded by memory, preparation, and resolve. When the Empire finally decided to cross it openly, they believed they were taking the first step toward conquest. In reality, they were stepping into a response that had been waiting patiently for a very long time. The decision was made far away from Terran space, inside the heart of the Empire, where war was discussed like mathematics rather than consequence. The Imperial High Council gathered in a chamber designed to inspire confidence, surrounded by holographic star maps and shifting data streams. For them, conflict was not emotional. It was numerical. Borders were lines to be tested, and resistance was something that could be measured, predicted, and crushed. Imperial analysts presented their findings with calm certainty. Human space appeared small compared to the Empire's vast territory. Terran fleets were compact, practical, and lacking the massive war formations the Empire favored. There were no grand armadas on display, no intimidating superstructures parked at borders. Trade records showed humans focused inward, investing in infrastructure instead of conquest. To Imperial leadership, this painted a clear picture. Terra was defensive, limited, and unlikely to escalate. They compared humans to other species the Empire had absorbed before. The pattern always began the same way: a quiet neighbor, a strong border policy, a desire for peace. Then came pressure, a minor violation, a show of force. Eventually, negotiations would follow, always ending with concessions. The Empire believed humans would follow the same path because everyone always had. What the Empire did not consider was why humans appeared the way they did. Human military power was not built to impress observers. Their fleets were designed for function, not intimidation. Ships carried modular systems that could change roles within hours. Weapons were concealed, layered, and adaptive. Most importantly, much of Terran military strength was not visible on public channels at all. The Empire relied heavily on observable power. Humans relied on readiness. The Council debated timing, not outcome. Some advisors suggested waiting longer, testing diplomacy one final time. Others argued that delay would only allow Terra to strengthen further. In the end, ambition won. The Empire authorized a controlled border crossing, small enough to avoid immediate galactic backlash, but large enough to force a reaction. It would be framed as a navigational oversight, followed by a demand for joint patrol rights. To Imperial leaders, it was elegant, clean, almost polite. Orders were issued down the chain of command. Fleet captains were told to expect minimal resistance. Rules of engagement were written to allow escalation only if necessary. The Empire did not want a war yet. They wanted compliance. Officers joked openly about how quickly humans would fold once they saw Imperial hulls up close. Meanwhile, human systems received no threats, no ultimatums, no grand warnings. The Empire believed surprise would create advantage. What they failed to understand was that humans had already anticipated this exact move. For decades, Terran strategists had studied Imperial expansion patterns. Every absorbed civilization had followed similar stages, and every invasion began with a limited action meant to test resolve. From the human point of view, the Empire was not being clever. It was being predictable. Imperial simulations showed a short engagement followed by diplomatic talks under Imperial terms. What those simulations lacked was a variable the Empire had never learned to measure properly: human response time. Humans did not need to debate or vote once a line was crossed. Their doctrine assumed that borders existed for a reason, and violating them removed the need for further discussion. As fleets prepared to move, some Imperial commanders expressed quiet concern. Terran silence felt different from fear. There were no desperate transmissions, no rushed defensive movements, no visible confusion. But those doubts were dismissed as overthinking. The Empire trusted its size, its experience, and its history of victories. The greatest mistake was not underestimating Terran weapons or ships. It was underestimating Terran intent. Humans were not preparing to negotiate. They were preparing to end a pattern they had seen destroy others. The Empire believed it was making a calculated move, one backed by logic and precedent. In reality, it was repeating an old mistake in front of a species that had learned very well from history. When the order to cross the border was finally given, Imperial leaders believed they were still in control of the situation. They believed they could step back if needed, adjust tactics, and manage consequences. They did not yet understand that the moment the decision was made, control had already slipped away. The moment the Imperial fleet crossed into Terran space, nothing dramatic happened at first. No alarms echoed across the galaxy, no warnings were broadcast on open channels, and no massive Terran armada appeared to block their path. The Imperial commanders took this calm as confirmation of everything they believed. Humans were watching. Yes, but they were hesitating. The Empire continued forward, confident that fear would soon follow. Terran patrol ships appeared quietly, slipping into formation at a careful distance. They did not lock weapons or send threats. Instead, they matched speed, mirrored movement, and observed. Imperial sensors struggled to get clear readings, as if the Terran ships were constantly adjusting their signatures. This behavior confused Imperial officers. It did not look like an attack, but it also did not look like surrender. A short, formal transmission was sent from Terran command. It was calm, precise, and brief. The message stated that Imperial vessels were in restricted space and must change course immediately. There was no emotion in the voice, no hint of anger or fear. To the Empire, this sounded like a weak protest, something meant to save face rather than enforce authority. Imperial commanders responded with their own message, equally calm but clearly dismissive. They claimed navigational error and requested temporary passage rights to stabilize their fleet. While the message sounded diplomatic, their ships continued moving deeper into Terran territory. It was a calculated insult designed to show dominance without openly declaring war. For several long seconds, nothing happened. Then Terran ships moved. Without warning shots or loud displays, human vessels activated systems the Empire had never encountered before. Imperial engines began to fail one by one, shutting down as if turned off by an invisible hand. Communications flickered and died. Targeting systems fed false data, showing ships where nothing existed and hiding threats that were dangerously close. Imperial captains tried to regain control, assuming these were temporary malfunctions. Orders were shouted across bridges, technicians rushed to consoles, and emergency protocols were activated. Nothing worked. The systems were not damaged. They were overridden. Panic began to spread as Terran ships closed in, still silent, still controlled. Only then did the Empire realize that this was not a warning. It was enforcement. One Imperial destroyer, confused and desperate, fired its weapons. The shot never reached its target. Terran defenses adjusted instantly, absorbing the energy and redirecting it harmlessly into space. In response, a single Terran strike disabled the destroyer completely. Not destroyed. Disabled. Power gone. Weapons offline. Crew alive but helpless. Within moments, several Imperial ships vanished from tactical displays. They did not explode. They simply disappeared, pulled out of sensor range by methods the Empire could not track. Survivors transmitted fragmented reports, describing Terran weapons that changed frequency mid-fire and defenses that adapted faster than any known system should allow. What shocked the Empire most was the lack of chaos on the Terran side. Human movements were coordinated, efficient, and restrained. They did not chase fleeing ships. They did not press deeper into the Imperial formation. Every action served a purpose, and once that purpose was achieved, they stopped. Terran command finally transmitted again. The message was even shorter than the first. Imperial vessels were ordered to withdraw immediately. Any ship that attempted to advance or fire would be neutralized. There would be no further warnings. For the first time, Imperial commanders felt genuine fear. This was not the resistance they expected. This was not desperation or pride. This was control. Humans were not reacting emotionally. They were executing a plan that had already been written. As surviving Imperial ships struggled to retreat, Terran forces allowed them to go. They did not pursue. They did not boast. They recorded everything. The message was clear. This encounter was not meant to be a victory display. It was meant to be a lesson. Across the galaxy, observers struggled to understand what had happened. Reports conflicted. Some claimed the Empire had won, but retreated strategically. Others spoke of unseen Terran weapons and flawless coordination. One thing, however, became undeniable. The Empire had fired first, and it had not gone as planned. For humans, this was not the beginning of war. It was the confirmation they needed. The line had been crossed, violence had been initiated, and intent was proven. From this moment forward, restraint was no longer required. The Empire had turned a calculated test into an irreversible mistake. After the first clash, the galaxy waited for a reaction from Terra. In past wars, this was the moment when governments rushed to control the narrative. There were usually emergency broadcasts, loud condemnations, and dramatic calls for allies. But from Terran space, nothing came. No speeches, no threats, no explanations. The silence was complete and deeply unsettling. At first, many believed this silence meant confusion or fear. Commentators across neutral systems speculated that humans were divided, arguing among themselves about what to do next. The Empire encouraged this belief. Imperial diplomats spoke confidently, suggesting the incident had been exaggerated and that Terra had suffered a serious blow. They claimed humans were struggling to respond and urged the galaxy to remain calm. Behind that calm exterior, however, Terran space was anything but inactive. The silence was deliberate. Humans understood that words could reveal intent, and intent was something they no longer wished to share. Instead of public announcements, private confirmation codes moved through secure Terran networks. Every colony, shipyard, and defense platform received the same simple signal. It was not a call to panic. It was a shift in status. Trade lanes changed overnight. Merchant ships that normally crossed neutral space vanished from common routes. Some were recalled. Others were rerouted through protected corridors. Insurance networks noticed the changes before governments did. Human freight contracts were quietly suspended, and civilian traffic near border systems dropped to almost zero. On frontier worlds, families relocated with surprising order. There were no crowded ports or desperate scenes. Transports arrived on schedule. Evacuation lists were already prepared. To outside observers, it looked like a slow retreat. To humans, it was risk management practiced to perfection. Military preparations followed the same pattern. Terran fleets did not surge toward the border. Instead, they spread out. Ships moved into positions that made little sense to foreign analysts. Defense stations adjusted orbits under the cover of routine maintenance. Deep space assets that had not transmitted in years came online briefly, then went dark again. The Empire watched all of this and misunderstood nearly every detail. Imperial intelligence focused on the absence of a direct response. They expected outrage, demands for apology, or at least a public declaration of hostility. When none came, they concluded that humans were trying to avoid escalation. Some Imperial commanders even argued that the initial encounter had scared Terra more than it admitted. This belief hardened into confidence. Imperial media framed the silence as weakness. Commentators mocked human restraint, claiming it proved that Terra lacked the courage to confront a superior power openly. The Empire used this narrative to reassure its allies and quiet internal doubts. What they failed to notice was how coordinated Terran silence truly was. Human political systems, often criticized as slow and divided, moved with unusual unity. There were no leaks, no contradictory statements, no signs of internal disagreement. Every Terran institution acted as if following a single plan, one that had been rehearsed long before the Empire ever crossed the border. In neutral space, subtle signs began to appear. Independent traders reported that Terran supply hubs had closed without notice. Data brokers noticed increased encryption across human networks. Observatories detected unusual energy patterns deep inside Terran systems, far from any border. Still, Terra said nothing. For the Empire, this quiet became dangerous in a different way. Without a clear enemy response, Imperial leadership struggled to justify restraint. Hardliners argued that hesitation now would make the Empire look weak. If Terra would not protest, then perhaps it was already accepting Imperial dominance. Plans were revised. What had been a test began to look like an opportunity. From the human perspective, the situation had already changed completely. The first shots had been fired. The Empire had shown its intent, and humans believed intent mattered more than words. There was no need to convince the galaxy yet. There was only a need to prepare the conditions for what came next. The silence from Terra was not indecision. It was focus. Every minute without a public response forced the Empire to make assumptions. Every assumption pushed Imperial leadership closer to overconfidence. Humans had learned long ago that the most dangerous moment in any conflict was when the enemy believed they were still in control. By the time the Empire realized that Terran silence was not fear but preparation, the situation was already moving beyond diplomacy. The galaxy waited for Terra to speak, unaware that humans had chosen a different language altogether. The war did not begin with a declaration, and it did not begin at the border. When the Empire prepared its fleets for a larger push into Terran space, nothing seemed wrong at first. Ships moved on schedule, commanders followed standard procedures, and supply convoys departed as planned. To Imperial leadership, the situation looked stable. Terra was quiet, and silence was taken as surrender in slow motion. Then small problems began to appear. A fuel convoy failed to arrive at a scheduled rendezvous point. At first, it was blamed on a navigation delay. Soon after, another convoy reported system errors and turned back. Communication relays that connected distant Imperial sectors went offline without explosions or warnings. Messages had to be rerouted, arriving late or not at all. None of this looked like an attack. It looked like bad luck. Imperial engineers worked tirelessly to fix the issues, unaware that nothing was broken. Human operations had already begun, far from any battlefield. Terran ships were not hunting fleets. They were hunting structure. Using precise strikes and deep space infiltration, humans targeted the systems that allowed the Empire to move, supply, and command its forces. Supply depots disappeared overnight. Some were destroyed so cleanly that no debris field remained. Others were captured and emptied before Imperial forces even knew they were under threat. Navigation beacons began transmitting false data, slowly pulling ships off course. Fleets arrived at empty space where allies were supposed to be waiting. Imperial commanders grew frustrated. Orders had to be repeated, timelines slipped. Coordinated attacks became impossible. Still, many believed these issues were temporary. The Empire had faced disruptions before and had always adapted through sheer size and manpower. What made this war different was that humans did not give the Empire a target to strike back at. There were no massive Terran fleets engaging Imperial armadas, no glorious battles for Imperial propaganda to broadcast. Every human action was quiet, surgical, and difficult to trace. When Imperial patrols arrived at damaged sites, the Terran forces were already gone. As confusion spread, human activity increased. Entire Imperial task groups found themselves stranded without fuel or orders. Some commanders attempted independent action, only to discover that Terran systems had already predicted their movements. Human strategies did not rely on reacting. They relied on shaping the battlefield long before the Empire realized it was won. Inside the Empire, frustration turned into anger. Leaders demanded results. They ordered heavier fleets forward, believing more force would solve the problem. Instead, the problem grew. Larger fleets required more supply, more coordination, and more communication. Humans used that dependence against them. Imperial officers began to report something deeply unsettling. Terran attacks were not random. They followed patterns that suggested intimate knowledge of Imperial logistics. It was as if humans had studied their systems for years. In truth, they had. For decades, Terran analysts had observed Imperial expansion. They mapped supply routes, command hierarchies, and political dependencies. They learned which systems mattered and which could be sacrificed. When war came, humans did not aim to win battles. They aimed to remove the Empire's ability to fight at all. As Imperial sectors became isolated, panic spread among allied species. Worlds that relied on Imperial protection suddenly found themselves alone. Some began refusing to send resources. Others opened quiet channels with Terra, seeking reassurance or neutrality. The Empire's image of invincibility began to crack. The most terrifying part for Imperial leadership was the realization that this was not chaos. It was control. Humans were choosing when and where the Empire could move, communicate, and survive. Every delay, every failure, every unanswered message was part of a larger design. By the time the Empire understood that it was already at war, the shape of that war had been decided. Humans had turned distance into a weapon and patience into a strategy. The conflict the Empire had expected, loud and decisive, never came. Instead, the Empire found itself fighting an enemy it could barely see, in a war it did not know how to end. As the Empire realized its supply lines were failing, frustration turned into desperation. Imperial fleets had always relied on numbers and firepower to overwhelm opponents. They believed that if they brought enough ships and weapons to bear, no enemy could resist. Terran strategy did not follow that logic. Humans avoided direct confrontation when it was unnecessary. Instead, they dismantled the Empire's ability to wage war at every level, from logistics to communications. Imperial commanders began deploying heavier ships, larger fleets, and even experimental weapons, believing that sheer force would restore control. Each move was carefully noted by human intelligence. Terran forces observed, adapted, and countered without visible fleets or open combat. Imperial ships found themselves targeted not in battle, but in the systems that kept them functioning. Fuel depots, repair stations, and supply convoys were disabled with precision. Terran attacks were surgical, leaving no room for retaliation. Captured Imperial officers described something that shook their leadership. Humans seemed to anticipate every step. Every tactic, every maneuver, every contingency the Empire had planned appeared in human simulations weeks, months, or even years before execution. Terran strategists had studied the Empire extensively, learning patterns from historical campaigns, observing political behavior, and predicting chain-of-command responses. Humans did not just react, they predicted. Imperial fleets became frustrated. They could no longer count on predictable outcomes. A squadron sent to reinforce a border system found it abandoned. Their targets had moved before the first shot was fired. Communication channels that should have connected them to command were jammed, rerouted, or supplying false data. Confusion spread, but there was no panic on the human side. Every human ship, every platform, and every colony operated with calm, purposeful efficiency. As losses mounted, the Empire attempted escalation. Heavier weapons, more destructive measures, and forbidden technology were deployed. In the past, these tactics had crushed opposition quickly. Against humans, they only highlighted Terran adaptability. Every escalation was met with a counter that neutralized the threat with minimal exposure. Imperial leaders began to realize that human strength was not in raw power, but in control, foresight, and patience. Terran forces never sought to destroy Imperial personnel unnecessarily. Civilians remained untouched. Ships were disabled instead of destroyed. Territories were controlled strategically, not through occupation. It became clear that humans did not fight for land, glory, or dominance. They fought to ensure that no enemy could ever threaten them again. Every move was deliberate, every strike measured. The psychological effect on the Empire was devastating. Commanders accustomed to obedience and submission now faced an enemy who anticipated, adapted, and executed with flawless precision. Confidence eroded into doubt. Every decision, once easy and routine, became a risk. Officers questioned their plans, fearing that humans had already foreseen their intentions. Coordination, once a strength of the Empire, turned into vulnerability. Internal communications within the Empire began to reveal cracks. Factions debated whether to continue the campaign or negotiate. Some argued that humans were bluffing and that a final push would restore dominance. Others warned that every failed action strengthened human control. The Empire's authority, once unquestioned, faced subtle rebellion from those who no longer trusted command judgment. From the human perspective, every Imperial escalation was expected. Humans had planned for overconfidence, missteps, and forbidden technology. Defensive systems had redundancies. Fleets had backup communication channels. Logistics were flexible and constantly monitored. Humans turned Imperial assumptions against them, using the Empire's own strategies as vulnerabilities. By the time Imperial leadership realized the full extent of the situation, the war had already shifted. Humans were not fighting in the traditional sense. They had removed the Empire's ability to move, communicate, and coordinate effectively. Imperial forces were isolated, overextended, and increasingly ineffective. The more the Empire tried to respond, the more it revealed itself to Terran observation. It became clear that human strategy was simple but devastatingly effective. They did not fight to win battles. They fought to remove the Empire's capacity to wage war entirely. Territory, casualties, or immediate victories were secondary. The endgame was control, preparation, and certainty. Every action the Empire took only accelerated the inevitable conclusion. By the time the Empire understood what was happening, it was already too late. As the Empire struggled to respond, the cracks within its authority began to spread rapidly. Member species, once loyal to Imperial command, began to question orders as news of repeated failures circulated. Worlds that had relied on Imperial protection suddenly felt exposed. Local governors refused to send resources or obey fleet movements without proof that their contributions would matter. Imperial spokespeople attempted to reassure allies, but the silence and inaction from Terran space spoke louder than any broadcast. Fleets that had once operated with unquestioned obedience now hesitated. Orders to engage or reinforce were met with delays, confusion, and occasionally outright refusal. Some captains argued that any action without a clear understanding of Terran capabilities would be suicidal. Internal tension grew, and the chain of command weakened. High-ranking officers began to clash in private councils, each blaming the other for the ongoing failures. Coordination, the Empire's greatest strength, dissolved into disarray. Human forces, meanwhile, observed without overt confrontation. Terrans did not need to destroy it outright or occupy planets to achieve their objectives. They had learned that the Empire's size, once an advantage, could be turned against itself. By targeting supply lines, communications, and logistics, humans forced Imperial forces to rely on incomplete information and improvisation. Confusion spread not because of human attacks on personnel, but because the Empire's own systems were failing under pressure. Imperial leaders attempted desperate measures. Heavier fleets were dispatched to secure critical sectors. Forbidden technology was used in isolated operations. Orders were given to enforce Imperial dominance with overwhelming force. Yet every move played into Terran strategy. Human forces adapted quickly, anticipating Imperial escalation and neutralizing it without unnecessary exposure. What the Empire believed were decisive strikes became predictable, contained, and ultimately ineffective. As frustration grew, factions within the Empire began to openly argue about the future. Some suggested negotiating with Terra immediately, fearing further destabilization of loyal member worlds. Others insisted that retreat would signal weakness, potentially leading to rebellion and the loss of more territory. The Empire, once unified in purpose and belief, was now divided, with each faction pursuing conflicting strategies. Terran operations continued with quiet precision. Each time the Empire attempted to consolidate forces, humans disrupted supply lines or communications. Imperial units found themselves isolated, cut off from reinforcements, and forced to operate with minimal intelligence. Humans targeted not individuals but systems, striking at the very structure that allowed the Empire to function. Territory changed hands or became inaccessible, yet casualties were kept low, demonstrating control rather than aggression. Captured Imperial officers spoke of Terran methods with a mixture of awe and fear. They described fleets that seemed to anticipate every movement, systems that adapted faster than Imperial engineers could analyze, and operations that relied on prediction rather than brute force. Human strategy did not aim for immediate victory. It aimed to remove the Empire's ability to act effectively, leaving it fractured, vulnerable, and dependent on chance. As member species observed the Empire's failures, doubt spread. Worlds that had once supplied troops and resources began to withhold support. Trade networks faltered. Political loyalty eroded. What had started as a war with humans now threatened to unravel the Empire from within. Human forces had effectively weaponized patience, control, and observation, turning Imperial strengths into weaknesses without engaging in traditional battles. By the time the Empire acknowledged the full scope of the problem, it was too late to reverse the damage. Coordination had collapsed, morale was low, and leadership struggled to assert authority. Every command issued required careful calculation, as any mistake could worsen the situation. Humans did not need to strike with overwhelming force. They had already achieved the most difficult victory, destabilizing the largest power in the galaxy without exposing themselves unnecessarily. The Empire's greatest mistake was underestimating humans not in combat ability, but in strategy, discipline, and foresight. Terran actions demonstrated that true power did not always come from fleets or weapons, but from the ability to predict, control, and remove an enemy's capacity to act. What remained of the Empire could still fight, but it could no longer command with certainty. Trust, cohesion, and obedience, the foundation of Imperial authority, had been broken. Human forces had won without a single monumental battle, leaving the Empire isolated, fractured, and on the defensive. The war ended quietly, without fanfare, without parades, and without the fireworks that the galaxy had come to expect from great victories. There were no grand speeches from Terran leaders, no fleets sailing triumphantly into captured systems, and no proclamations of dominance. Instead, human forces began to withdraw methodically, leaving every system, every station, and every fleet exactly as they had found it, except for the Imperial structures that had been rendered ineffective. The message was clear. Humans did not fight to conquer. They fought to prevent threat, to enforce boundaries, and to secure peace for their people. Imperial leadership was forced to negotiate, not from strength, but from necessity. The Empire had no fleets capable of enforcing its will, no reliable supply lines, and no cohesion in its command structure. Diplomats arrived under heavy security, aware that any mistake could provoke the Terran forces. The terms were precise and unyielding. Terran sovereignty was recognized, Imperial forces were restricted from the borders, and any future transgressions would trigger immediate retaliation. The Empire had crossed the line and learned the cost firsthand. Everywhere in the galaxy, observers were stunned. Civilizations that had watched the conflict unfold saw a power that had never been defeated in such a subtle, precise way. Terra did not rely on overwhelming numbers or flashy displays of strength. It relied on preparation, intelligence, patience, and a strategy that targeted the Empire's weaknesses without unnecessary destruction. What appeared to outsiders as restraint was actually dominance, a demonstration of power in its purest form. For humans, the conflict was over not with triumph, but with understanding. They had never sought war, but once the Empire had crossed the border, action was inevitable. Every defensive maneuver, every strike against logistics and communications had been measured and deliberate. Civilian populations had remained safe, colonies had been protected, and no unnecessary damage had been inflicted. Victory was not about land or resources. It was about ensuring that no future threat could ever arise from the same mistake. The Empire, once confident in its superiority, was humbled. Internal factions debated endlessly how they had miscalculated, how they had underestimated a species that appeared small, quiet, and unthreatening. Historians later described the campaign as a lesson in hubris, a demonstration that arrogance and assumptions could lead even the mightiest empires into disaster. Military leaders reviewed every report, every failed strategy, and every misstep, trying to understand how humans had turned their own strengths against them. Across Terran space, life returned to normal. Ships resumed regular patrols, trade continued along pre-existing routes, and human colonies thrived without interruption. To the outside eye, everything looked calm, almost mundane. But the galaxy knew that behind that calm was the quiet certainty of a species that had defended itself flawlessly. Humans had sent a warning that would echo through generations. Borders were not suggestions, and crossing them had consequences. The Empire, fractured and weakened, struggled to regain authority. Some member species abandoned their loyalty, others sought new alliances, and the political structure that had once seemed unbreakable now relied on negotiation, persuasion, and compromise. For centuries, Terran forces had not sought to dominate. Now, the galaxy understood why. Humanity's approach was not to destroy, but to neutralize threats completely and efficiently. The final lesson was written not in the rubble of war or in captured territories, but in history itself. The Empire had crossed Terran borders, and in doing so had signed its own death warrant. What had seemed like a minor incursion became a decisive turning point, demonstrating that intelligence, patience, and preparation could outweigh even the largest fleets and most destructive weapons. The galaxy had seen many wars, but none so quietly final. Humans had proven something far more important than military might. They had shown that true strength lay in foresight, discipline, and the ability to act only when necessary. The Empire had learned this lesson too late, and the memory of their mistake would linger for generations. Terra had not celebrated. Terra had not gloat. Terra had simply ensured its survival and reminded the universe that crossing their line came with a price that no one could afford to ignore.